The wheelchair came to rest in row 7 just as the boarding door groaned shut, and the man in it closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Not from fatigue, not from pain, but from the particular discipline of someone who has learned to take silence wherever he can find it. His name was Colonel Marcus Elijah Webb, United States Army, retired. He was 53 years old. His face carried the specific weathering of a man who had spent decades in high-altitude desert environments. Deep creases scoring the outer corners of his eyes, a sun-bleached ridge along his brow, the jawline of someone who had never once in his adult life been talked out of anything. His skin was dark brown and close-shaved, and there was a scar along the left side of his chin, thin and pale, from a piece of truck glass he'd been told to forget about because other things required his attention that night. His hands were large and scarred at the knuckles, the right one bearing a faded ridge where a piece of shrapnel had been pressed out by his own thumb on a hillside in Cunner Province 14 years ago, with a folding knife and no anesthetic and a corpseman watching from 6 feet away with the expression of a man learning something important about human thresholds. American Airlines Flight 518, scheduled to depart Denver International at 7:10 on a Tuesday morning in February, was a Boeing 737-800 making the 2-hour 45-minute run to Reagan National. The first pale orange of a winter sunrise bled weakly through the terminal windows as passengers filed down the jetway, dragging their rollerboards over the gap with that specific mixture of exhaustion and resentment that defines early air travel. Inside the cabin, the air carried stale upholstery and someone's breakfast sandwich, undercut by the faint chemical bite of recycled ventilation, the particular atmosphere of a machine that has moved people through the sky so many times it no longer pretends to smell like anything else. Colonel Webb occupied 7A, the bulkhead window seat that afforded the extra legroom his transfer required. He wore his Army service uniform, the dark olive dress coat carrying 4 rows of ribbons above the left breast pocket, the combat infantryman badge above those, and at the very top, suspended from a powder blue ribbon around his neck, the 5-pointed star of the Medal of Honor. He had stood in his Denver hotel bathroom for 40 minutes debating it. He was flying to Arlington. He was going to bury Staff Sergeant Darnell Okoye, who had been 24 years old when he had thrown himself across a triggered pressure plate to buy Marcus Webb a half-second to move, who had not died then but had died on Monday at 51, from the accumulated damage of a body that had been pressed past every reasonable human limit for 3 decades. Darnell had asked, in his last phone call, that Marcus be the one to say something. Marcus would wear the uniform. He would wear all of it. He managed the transfer from the aisle chair to the aircraft seat in a single practiced arc, left hand gripping the overhead bin edge, right arm taking his weight and rotating, the kind of motion that has been repeated several thousand times until it contains no hesitation. A flight attendant named Renee, compact and 50-ish, with a dark braid and a small sun sticker on her name tag she'd clearly forgotten to remove, had been standing by but understood immediately that he neither needed nor wanted help. She had simply cleared the aisle and kept her expression professionally neutral, and in doing so expressed a respect more genuine than most people manage with words. 2 rows back, Gerald Kowalski, heavy-set and roughly 60, in the rumpled burgundy of someone who had packed this morning in the dark, was wrestling with a coat he wanted to fold into a configuration the seat pocket clearly could not accommodate. In 7B, a young woman named Priya had already removed her shoes, tucked her feet beneath her, and opened a textbook thick enough to double as body armor. She had the posture of someone who had made her peace with long flights before her 30th birthday. 1 row ahead of Marcus, a mother named Jessica Tolliver, her conference lanyard still looped around her neck, reading Tolliver J., was coaxing a small boy of perhaps 5 years away from the oval window, saying, "Baby, sit back," in the fond, entirely ineffective voice of someone who has accepted that this particular request will never land. The boy's name, based on the dozen times Jessica said it over the next 4 minutes, was Cal. Cal had pressed his nose flat against the glass and was watching a baggage cart move across the tarmac with the concentrated reverence of a person witnessing a miracle. Renee passed through the aisle on her final boarding check. She caught Colonel Webb's eye, glanced at the medal, and looked back at his face. Something shifted in her expression, a gravity, a recognition, before she moved forward without making it a moment. The captain's voice came through the intercom with the unhurried confidence of a man who has done this long enough that early morning is simply morning. "This is Captain Rodriguez up front. We're looking at clear skies all the way to DC this morning. Flight time 2 hours 45. Sit back and let us take care of you. The plane shuddered forward on the taxiway. Cal pressed his hands flat against the oval glass and made a sound of pure delight. Marcus Webb looked past him at the flat gray tarmac, at the frost on the painted runway lines, at the flat brown plains beyond the airport fence. He thought about Darnell Okoye, who had grown up in Phoenix and had hated the cold with a theatrical ferocity for every one of the 27 years Marcus had known him, and who had a running joke about it that had survived 3 deployments, 2 marriages, and whatever his body had finally become. And Marcus was going to say something true at that church in Arlington at 2 o'clock this afternoon, in front of Sandra and the grandkids and the men they'd served with, and he needed to know what it was. Then, from somewhere just behind the sealed boarding door, came a voice that arrived before its owner did. It carried. That was the first thing about it. It cut through the cabin hum the way a particular frequency cuts through noise, not because it was especially loud but because it had the absolute certainty of a sound that has never once questioned its own right to be heard. I don't care what the ticket says. I have platinum status and I am not sitting in row 14. Her name, as she volunteered it 3 separate times in the following 7 minutes, was Diane Mercerhall. She appeared at the head of the jetway behind a gate agent who was trying to keep pace and failing, a woman in her late 50s with the immaculate, labor-intensive appearance of someone for whom appearance is full-time employment. The blowout that doesn't survive wind. The cream-colored Calvin Klein blazer with gold buttons that caught the light. A pair of oversized Gucci frames pushed up into her hair like a crown she had absent-mindedly misplaced. She moved through the cabin entrance with the unhurried confidence of someone who believes that space will rearrange itself around her passage because it always has. Her carry-on was a rolling Toomey duffel in gunmetal gray, approximately 4 inches too wide for the overhead bins. She discovered this in row 6. She attempted insertion with the slow, shoulder-weighted momentum of someone who has never seriously engaged with the concept of fixed dimensions. The bin refused. She tried again, harder. A canvas tote belonging to Gerald Kowalski slid forward and bumped her hand. "Whose bag is this?" she announced to the cabin. Gerald raised his hand with the expression of a man who is tired in a specific and ancient way. "It needs to come out. I have medication in here that can't be gate-checked." She gestured at her duffel with the sweep of someone presenting evidence. "This is a medical necessity." Tyler, the younger flight attendant, blonde, careful, maybe 27, materialized with the professional pleasantness of someone trained to absorb impact without flinching. "I can tag it for you right now. Ms. Mercerhall, complimentary. It goes right in the hold." "I said I cannot gate-check this bag." She didn't look at him. "I've already spoken to someone in Denver about this. I have a relationship with the Vice President of Passenger Services, and I will be on the phone with him before we land, and I would encourage you to—" "I completely understand," Tyler said, which was a lie as graceful as any ever told in a confined space. The duffel was eventually forced into the bin at an angle that prevented the door from closing, which Diane observed with the expression of a woman cataloging grievances. She found seat 14C, stood over it for a moment with the proprietorial survey of a landlord inspecting a property she intends to dispute, then sat. The man in 14A, a young man with headphones who had not yet noticed her, became aware of her when she pointed at the reclined seat back in front of her row and said, "Is that yours?" He removed one earbud. "That's not my seat." She processed this. She opened her bag. She removed a water bottle, took a long drink with the deliberateness of someone performing hydration, replaced the bottle, and then turned her gaze slowly forward through the cabin with the slow rotation of something searching. Her eyes settled on row 7, on Marcus Webb, who had closed his eyes in that 3-second discipline of his, on the powder blue ribbon at his collar, on the gold 5-pointed star of the Medal of Honor catching the gray February light from the oval window. She looked at it for approximately 10 seconds. Something moved across her face, a calculation, an assessment, the particular expression of a person who has located a problem they intend to solve. She unfastened her seatbelt. "Excuse me." Her voice arrived in row 7 before she did. Marcus Webb opened his eyes. She was standing in the aisle, one hand on the headrest of 6C for balance, looking down at the medal with an expression that had nothing to do with awe and everything to do with appraisal. the slow, entitled inspection of a customs agent who has decided a bag looks wrong. "Is that real?" she said. He looked at her. He said nothing. "I only ask," she continued, lowering her voice into the register people use when they want to sound reasonable while saying something that is not. "Because there's actually a lot of this happening. People wear military decorations on planes for, I don't know, sympathy, upgrades, whatever. I've read about it. And that is a federal offense, misrepresenting military service, so I think someone should—" "Diane." Tyler had appeared from the front galley. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to return to your seat. I'm having a conversation." She did not look at Tyler. She was looking at Marcus Webb, who had not moved, whose hands lay flat on his thighs with a stillness so deliberate it registered as its own kind of statement. "I'm simply asking whether that decoration is legitimate. Because if it's a costume—" "It is not a costume," Tyler said, and something in his voice had changed. "I'd like him to answer." She looked at the medal. Then she said the thing. She said it the way people say things they have calculated are just barely on the tolerable side of a line they are actively choosing not to see. "Because, honestly, where I come from, you don't often see men like— it's unusual is all I'm saying." The air in the cabin shifted the way air shifts when a temperature drops. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds. Diane Mercer Hall reached forward and closed her fingers around the Medal of Honor. The blue ribbon pulled taut against the back of Marcus Webb's neck. She did not yank. It was worse than a yank. She pulled with the slow, insistent pressure of someone testing a door they are certain is unlocked. The clasp at the back of the ribbon pressed into the skin above his collar like a coal held flat. He felt the weight of the metal shift, the ribbon bite, the specific and unbearable indignity of a hand that had no right in this world closing around something men had bled to give him the right to wear. He felt his pulse in his temples. He felt, beneath the shock and the heat and the controlled absolute fury, a grief so old it had its own weight, because the man whose funeral he was flying toward had been 12 feet away when the action that earned this medal was committed, and had held Marcus's legs in his hands in the seconds after the blast, and this woman's fingers were on it now. He did not move. His jaw set. His hands remained flat and still. His expression held the particular blankness of a man who has decided not to react. The most expensive decision a person can make in real time, paid for in full and without complaint. "This is plastic," Diane announced to the cabin. Her voice had achieved a bright, satisfied triumph. "This is not real. This is—" "Let go of that medal." Renee had come from the front galley. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. In 31 years of working in sealed metal tubes with frightened and hostile human beings, she had learned that volume is for people who aren't sure they'll be heard. "Take your hand off that medal right now, ma'am." Diane's fingers released. The medal swung back. The ribbon had left a thin red line above Marcus Webb's collar. He reached up, one deliberate, unhurried movement, and straightened it. His face still held that expression. He was paying attention to what it cost him. She grabbed it off him. The man in 18C, late 30s, conference shirt under a suit jacket, had risen to his feet and was staring with his mouth open. She grabbed it. "I barely touched it," Diane said. Her voice had thinned perceptibly. "I was making a point. My son is looking at you right now." Jessica Tolliver's voice came from 6A, low and shaking and precise. "He is 5 years old, and he is watching you put your hands on that man." Priya had her phone out, angled toward the aisle. Her hands were not quite steady. Gerald Kowalski had come 6 rows forward and was standing in the aisle with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who has quietly concluded something. "That ribbon," Renee said, and she said it the way someone reads a ruling aloud, level, irrevocable, final, "is the Medal of Honor. It is the highest decoration awarded by the United States government. And you put your hands on it." She pressed the call button above 7A. The chime rang through the sealed space like a bell. "Return to your seat. This is not a request. You cannot speak to me this way." Diane's voice had climbed into a register that was trying for outrage and landing somewhere closer to fear. "Do you have any idea? My husband sits on the board of—" She stopped herself. The sentence collapsed under its own weight. She looked around the cabin at Priya's phone, at the faces turned toward her, at Gerald in the aisle with his deliberate stillness, at Jessica with her hand over Cal's eyes even though Cal had already seen everything. She looked at Renee, who was simply standing there with the quiet authority of someone who has no need to perform authority. And she looked at Marcus Webb. He had been looking at her since she reached for the medal. He had not looked away. His expression was still that deliberate blankness, the accounting, the soldier's arithmetic of a man adding up what has happened and deciding what to do with the sum. "This isn't over," she said to him. "No," he said, "just that." In the voice of a man who has said things in places where the stakes of language were absolute, and who knows precisely what weight to put behind a single syllable. She walked back to 14C. The intercom opened. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through, quieter than before, measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hold our position for a few minutes. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." 2 rows behind Marcus, a man in a gray Patagonia vest had not stood, had not called out, had watched from the moment Diane Mercerhall left her seat with the quality of attention that is itself a trained skill. He was compact and 40-something and unremarkable in the specific way that men who are professionally required to be unremarkable learn to be. His name was Special Agent Carl Dempsey. He had been an air marshal for 11 years, and he had already pressed the button. The plane sat on the taxiway for 17 minutes. The kind of stillness that is not peaceful. From 7A, Marcus Webb could hear Diane at the back of the cabin. Not the words, but the current of them. The unbroken low frequency of self-exculpation directed at the empty middle seat beside her. Barely touched. Completely insane. Don't even know why people, in this country. He folded his hands and looked at the frost on the runway lines and thought about Darnell Okoye, who had grown up in Phoenix, who had never owned a winter coat that fit properly, who had a joke about Denver specifically that involved the phrase voluntarily uninhabitable, and who had told it with the specific delight of a man who finds life funnier than it has any business being. He would not tell it today. He would find something true. He heard Dempsey's footsteps before he saw him move. Dempsey came down the aisle with the unhurried, weighted gait of a man who knows exactly where he's going and has no interest in being stopped. He stopped at row 14. He did not crouch. He held his badge, Department of Homeland Security, Federal Air Marshal Service, gold shield on black leather, open at eye level with the practiced ease of a man who has done this enough times that the gesture has become grammar. His voice was low, conversational, final. "Ms. Mercerhall, I need you to come with me." The cabin condensed into silence. "Come where?" She looked at the badge and looked away from it. "I'm in my seat. I have paid for this seat. You are being removed from this aircraft. Please take only what you immediately need and stand. This is because of..." Her voice lurched. "I didn't hurt anyone. It was a question. I asked a question and I..." "Please stand, ma'am." She looked around the cabin one more time for the ally who was not there, for the single face that would give her back the premise she'd arrived with. She found Priya, who looked away. She found Gerald, who did not. She found the man in 18C, who had sat back down but was watching with the careful attention of a witness who intends to remember. She found Cal, who had turned from the window and was watching her with the unblinking, uncomplicated gaze of a child who does not yet know how to pretend he didn't see something. She did not find Marcus Webb looking at her. Marcus Webb had reached into the left breast pocket of his dress coat. The cabin watched him do it. Every eye in the visible rows followed the movement, deliberate, unhurried, the motion of a man who has decided what happens next and made his peace with the decision. He removed a credentials wallet, burgundy leather worn smooth at the fold. The seal of the United States Army embossed on the cover in gold that had matured past shine into something more serious. He held it open without standing, without raising his voice, without turning his head more than was necessary. "My name is Colonel Marcus Elijah Webb, United States Army, retired." His voice filled the cabin the way the captain's voice had filled it. Not loud, but placed, each word occupying its correct position. Medal of Honor recipient, currently serving as a senior advisor to the United States Army Congressional Liaison Office. The decoration Ms. Mercerhall removed from my person is the property of the United States government, and its physical removal constitutes federal assault and theft of government property. I have said what I needed to say. He closed the wallet. Agent Dempsey. The cabin made a sound. Not applause. Not yet. The sound of a pressurized space suddenly releasing. A collective exhalation. Then the first scattered voice. Then more, building from the back forward like something rolling uphill. Diane Mercerhall's face moved through 5 expressions in roughly 12 seconds. Confusion first. Genuine, brow furrowed. The face of a person who has not yet calibrated the size of what she has stepped into. Then recalibration the moment the word colonel settled, and then congressional liaison, and then the compounding weight of all the assumptions she had made on the basis of what she thought she was looking at, stacking up now into something that resembled a cliff. Then the reach for recovery. A smile-adjacent expression. The instinct of someone who has spent decades believing she could reframe any room she had entered. Then the understanding that this room does not work that way. That it stopped working that way approximately 18 minutes ago and has only become more so. Then the deflation. The specific collapse of a face that has arranged itself for decades around a premise that has just been removed. I was only, she said. Ms. Mercerhall, Dempsey said. Now, please. She stood. He walked her forward. She did not put her eyes on row 7 as she passed it, and Marcus Webb did not watch her pass. He had returned the wallet to his breast pocket and was looking out the oval window at the pale February morning. She passed him close enough that her sleeve almost brushed the back of his seat. He watched the frost on the runway lines. The handcuffs went on at the jetway out of view of the passengers. Dempsey did it quietly and without theater, which was a courtesy no one would have demanded. The door sealed behind them. The intercom opened. Folks, this is Captain Rodriguez. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds, the pause of a man choosing his words. We'll be departing shortly. I want to thank every one of you for your patience. And on behalf of American Airlines and every member of this crew. Another pause. Thank you, Colonel. The applause began in 18C. It spread the way fire spreads when the conditions have been ready. Row by row, instant and total, and then Gerald was clapping in the aisle with his full hands, and Priya had closed her textbook and was clapping with her eyes bright, and even the young man in 14A, who had had his headphones in for most of this, had taken them out and was clapping without fully knowing why except that the room required it. Cal turned from the window and looked at his mother. Mama, he said, with the uncomplicated precision of a 5-year-old who has been watching very carefully. Is that man a hero? Jessica Tolliver pulled him against her side and looked at the back of the seat in front of her, and then at the ceiling, and then at her son. Yes, baby, she said. He is. Renee stood at the front of the galley and watched. She did not applaud. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to her mouth. Then she nodded once, not at anyone in particular, or perhaps at something she had learned about people in 31 years of working in the sky. 2 passengers came forward to row 7 separately. Not together. The man from 18C stopped in the aisle, put his hand out and said, Thank you for your service, sir. In the voice of someone who knows the phrase is insufficient and says it anyway because he has nothing larger to offer. The woman from 11B said nothing at all. She placed her hand briefly on Colonel Webb's shoulder. A quiet, complete gesture, and he covered it with his own, just for a moment, before she walked back to her seat. American Airlines Flight 518 departed Denver International at 8:02 a.m., 52 minutes behind schedule. The sky above the Rockies was the specific blue that February sometimes produces above altitude, pure and scoured and without explanation, the kind of blue that makes the word blue seem insufficient. Marcus Webb looked at it from 7A and let it be what it was. He didn't call anyone. He thought about calling Sandra Okoye, who was expecting him at 2 and who had last seen this uniform at the ceremony in the Rose Garden on a May morning 12 years ago, when Darnell had stood beside him with his arm in a sling and something in his eyes that was very close to pride and very far from peace. He would call when he landed. Some things needed to be said in a room with a person's face in front of you, the way Darnell would have done it. He was asleep before they crossed the Kansas border. His head rested against the oval window and his hands lay loose in his lap, and the metal at his throat rose and fell with his breathing, and Renee passed his row twice and each time adjusted the angle of his overhead light without touching anything else. Diane Mercerhall was processed at Denver International's Federal Security Office. where she was met by 2 Denver Police Department officers and an FBI special agent assigned to airport incident response. A federal criminal complaint was filed that afternoon under Title 49, Section 46504, interference with a flight crew, along with state charges for assault and theft of government property. American Airlines issued a statement by 4 p.m., a lifetime travel ban, effective immediately, and a comprehensive review of in-flight incident protocols, now bearing case number AA 518DN 0214. A formal written apology was directed to the Office of the Army Congressional Liaison on behalf of the airline and its crew. Colonel Marcus Elijah Webb's office acknowledged receipt of the apology the following morning. He was in Arlington by then. Outside the oval window, 34,000 feet above the brown winter plains, the light was the particular color of high altitude on a cold February morning, pale and radiant and without precedent, the blue of a sky that does not know it is being watched. The metal at his throat held the light for a moment, then let it go, and below, the land moved past in the vast and patient silence of a country that has sent its people a very long way and waited for them to come home.